Let's jump back to the gaming world of 1994. Platformers controlled the majority of the gaming market, and Nintendo is sweeping the competition as the Sega Genesis begins to lose its footing. However, everyone knows that 3D gaming is on the horizon, but nobody knows what it's supposed to look like. With the announcement of the Sony PlayStation, Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin of Naughty Dog set their sights on bringing the powerhouse genre of action platformer into the 3D world in an attempt to establish an early fanbase on the shiny new PlayStation. Obviously, Naughty Dog knocked it out of the park, but how did they do it? How did this tiny team create a brand new IP that outperformed Sony's own properties for years to come, setting itself in stone as one of the defining 3D platformers? Or more simply put, what's so great about Crash Bandicoot? The first issue that Naughty Dog had to address was how an action platformer would transfer into 3D, considering that even Nintendo was still developing Yoshi's Island at the time, not yet working in a 3D space, as the N64 hadn't even been announced. Gavin and Rubin realized the most awkward situation of bringing platformers into a 3D environment would be constantly staring at the back of the character. In fact, they even called their very first concept of Crash Bandicoot the Sonic's Ass Game, relating it to the idea of Sonic the Hedgehog being turned 90 degrees while playing. One way they lessened this dramatic transition was by including traditional side-scrolling levels to reduce the amount of time players spent looking at the back of the character, and to give players a bridge between what they were used to playing and the new 3D world of Crash Bandicoot. They also included a mixture of levels with movement towards and away from the camera to keep the point of view from growing stale. The designers started with simple level development, working with simpler formats to test new ideas, and then once they knew it worked, they went on to a new style. No matter the final order of levels, Naughty Dog based all of the gameplay off of what they knew was functional and enjoyable before attempting to break new ground. The very first level ever designed was Heavy Machinery, which constructed a pattern of familiar platforming aspects that could be reorganized in more complicated ways for other levels. The first levels of any new environment introduce the basic challenges of each location, while following levels combine new or more difficult challenges for a natural difficulty curve not only throughout the game, but throughout each locale. This difficulty curve and general self-teaching is inherent throughout the game. Several mechanics present themselves in easily digested pieces, all independently, before culminating to much more challenging puzzles. There's no sense of confusion about what every piece of the Crash Bandicoot universe means, even if that meant following the successful examples of other games. After all, great artists steal from each other to build something even greater. For example, the collection of 3 Aku Aku masks begins both visual and sound cues reminiscent of Super Mario Bros.' Starman power-up. There's no confusion of the fact that you are momentarily invincible. Even the very first time you collect an Aku Aku mask, even if you don't know what it does, the fact that it visibly floats around you means something has changed, and the moment you take damage, you understand the purpose of this very important core mechanic. From the unmistakable sounds of a TNT countdown to the subtle changes in movement and attacks from bosses throughout the game, Naughty Dog did an excellent job of constructing a world that taught any players that were willing to pay attention. It's practically inarguable that any mistakes a player makes throughout play were instantly recognizable, and therefore helped to lead the player into a better approach during their next attempt. Oddly enough, Crash Bandicoot's many signature crates were one of the last aspects added to the game, added just before the alpha build. Considering most platformers consist of various gaps, enemies, and, well, platforms, the crates gave a new source of puzzles, obstacles, and tools to interact with. The inclusion of TNT allowed for new approaches of dealing with enemies and secrets, and the unbreakable metal boxes forced the player to plot different paths. Not to mention it's just satisfying to break those boxes and try to find them all before the end of the level, adding a collectible aspect, and in fact, the act of breaking these crates even inspired Crash's final name. Let's discuss the most arguable aspect of Crash Bandicoot, the difficulty. Even while developing the game, Naughty Dog could see the frustration in early players' faces, whether they were E3 guests or secretaries at Universal Interactive. The developers realized there were little things they could add to make the game more relieving to players of varied skill levels, such as giving Aku Aku masks after several deaths, or slowing down that giant, unrelenting boulder with each failed attempt. The game, though never forfeiting its challenge, adapts to the ability of the player to provide a fair experience. As frustrating as it is, the difficulty is very well crafted. After all, there is no timer, outside of the optional time trial. The lack of a timer allows players to make their own discoveries, plan their movements, and tackle the obstacles at their own pace. And when introducing a new mechanic or threat, the game regularly provides a safe environment to make mistakes when necessary. For instance, some obstacles, such as the torch spring and shielded native, are not very dangerous on their own, but when added together can create devastating conflicts. And while some avid players would say that frustration has never been so fun, let's just all be glad that this isn't a coin-operated game. If this new 3D game was going to be successful, it not only had to play well, but it had to look as good as possible to take advantage of the new polygonal universe. Let's address the elephant in the room with the fact that we are using mostly footage from the remastered version. That's just for quality of the video, because, let's be honest, before we get into talking about what made Crash so amazing graphically at release, we have to accept that it is a 2-decade-old game and doesn't look great on screen capture. But let's talk about what made it so great at release. So on to what is arguably its greatest aspect, the art of Crash Bandicoot. First thing was first, the creation of Crash himself. Naughty Dog wanted a cute but unfamiliar animal like Sonic the Hedgehog or the Warner Brothers Tasmanian Devil. Inspired by the tropical environment of the recent Donkey Kong Country, the developers wanted an island that matched the character's Tasmanian origins. After considering the greens, browns, and other earthy tones, Crash's design had to consider a lot of visual restrictions inherent in the PlayStation's hardware. Everything about his design was tumultuously crafted to stand out on low-resolution displays. His orange fur was chosen to contrast against the earthy environments, even if it meant giving up the platformer staple of lava stages. Even his dark gloves and light chest helped to discern where he was facing and turning on a low polygon model. Now onto the most important aspect of Crash's design, his face. That is what set Crash apart from other characters of the era. Even though he is generally mute, Crash needed to have the same sense of character and humor visible in famous cartoon characters like Looney Tunes. His face was the largest part of his model to support his wacky expressions. This was so important because the majority of video game characters at this time were stone-faced. Consider the fact that the most you saw in terms of expression from other game mascots was Sonic's cocky smirk or a crying baby Mario. Even in the later 3D world of Super Mario 64, Mario doesn't even have a mouth when he says, "Here we go!" Crash's goofy, clownish behavior is what stamped him into the minds and hearts of gamers and solidified his position as Sony's unofficial mascot. With Crash's design sorted out, let's take a look at the world around him. After all, you can't have just one good-looking character. The art of the world itself was just as important as the gameplay. In fact, the artists of Crash Bandicoot would squint while testing levels to see if the colors contrasted enough to allow the game to be played by light levels alone. The key to the full, vibrant worlds of the game was how much Naughty Dog pushed the polygon limits and manipulated the graphical loopholes of the limited PlayStation hardware, even picking on details down to how many leaves they could have on screen at a time if they needed to cover certain sections of the screen from view. Visual quality in Crash, other characters, and the world around them was guaranteed by using textureless polygons to avoid texture issues inherent in the PlayStation's hardware. Combined with their expertise of loopholes and graphical manipulation was the use of vertex animations favored over bone-based animation, allowing for more flexibility in their cartoonish characters. Even after seeing Super Mario 64 at the highly anticipated E3 1996, Gavin and Ruben agreed that Crash Bandicoot looked far better. While they were still nervous about competing against Nintendo's beloved flagship franchise, they felt comfortable in the neatly packaged gift that they were delivering to the gaming world. And even with the dated visuals of the original version, it's obvious to see why they could make this claim so confidently. In fact, when the first gameplay footage was shown to Sony, they thought it looked so good that they claimed it was faked and sent over an employee to learn more about the game. The Naughty Dog team was so good at manipulating the limited power of the PlayStation that later on Sony themselves tried to create a competing title called Jalapeno Henry, and they themselves couldn't pull off what Naughty Dog had accomplished. Playing Crash Bandicoot even for a moment teaches you how the design and gameplay fold hand in hand. There's no doubt of how much Naughty Dog cared about the art behind the experience. Being released on an unproven console and competing against Nintendo's titan of a mascot himself, how was Naughty Dog supposed to create a worthy adversary in the 3D platforming world? Obviously, through extreme levels of blood, sweat, and tears. Working countless nights with their tiny team, arguing with producers over attempted redirections of their creation, and learning every single shortcut to save mere pixels and polygons, Naughty Dog finally crafted a game that impressed everyone who witnessed its release. While Super Mario 64 played smoother and allowed an early sense of free-roaming to players, Crash had both exceptional visuals and a backbone of tried-and-true gameplay expanded to the limits of a new machine. If you want to think about the internal sense of success between these two competing games, consider the fact that Sony pushed for a Crash sequel just a year later, while Nintendo didn't release Super Mario 64's gameplay successor until 2002. Naughty Dog came up with an idea for a fresh new generation of platforming, and ran with it despite every hardware limitation or marketing exec that told them otherwise. Their perseverance in the face of uncertainty allowed them to create a revolutionary new series that remains to be cited as one of the most powerful market-changing titles, as well as one of the greatest entries in the platforming genre for years to come. That is what's so great about Crash Bandicoot. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we spun through the world of Crash Bandicoot. We're tired of all of the jaded negativity in the gaming world, and we want to focus on what makes every aspect of gaming so great. If you think the same way, consider subscribing to be a part of our community, so you're always in on the discussions. Just a heads up, the next episode will be on Pokemon Nuzlocke mode, discussing the importance of fan improvement in games and how slight changes in gameplay can bring new life to an old classic. If you have a favorite series or single game that you think is great, leave a comment of your choice and we'll look into it. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.